Thank you, thank you. All right, so Brian Hicks, obviously from Dell EMC, here to talk about data protection and some of the solutions that we have. First and foremost, when you look at it, we have a wide portfolio. Obviously, with 15 minutes, we can only talk about the most important ones. But integrated and optimized data protection, right? We can do this on-premise. We can back up to the cloud. But most importantly, have the ability to back up in the cloud. Specifically here, since we're at the AWS conference, talking about AWS. But let's move forward. So enterprise data protection, what does that mean, right? So I can back up clients directly, right, to S3. Performance and scale really, really matter here. It's not a situation where, not to pick on different vendors, but just picking up a data protection plant and plopping it in AWS and say, hey, I can protect things and write to S3. That's not very efficient, right? The cost can increase rapidly. So with this type of scale, right, similar to on-prem, you can do about 28 terabytes, right, in 12 hours. So significant performance there. I get that from client direct backup. I'll talk a little bit about that. But the scale in terms of size, so one of these appliances, I can utilize up to 6 petabytes of logical capacity, and I get that with deduplication. And then minimal footprint, right? So obviously when I move to the cloud, things like CPU can run errant and be very, very cost performant. So when I do client level backup, when I have that scale of 6 petabytes, essentially I utilize lower EC2 and EBS instances, right, to drive that cost down. So it's a balanced approach with scale. Obviously, with the efficiency, I'm going to talk about the client. I'm going to show you a little diagram and walk through this. But security matters when we move to the cloud. So encrypting this data in flight, REST or HTTPS, but with AES 256-bit encryption, and then solutions that automatically back up. So I'm in the cloud. If they go down or you have a failure, essentially auto-protecting the instance, writing it to S3, so I can bring that back and recover if the instance of the data protection server pieces fail. Now here's kind of the diagram, and I'll walk through it. So when we say at Dell EMC, architecture matters, we weren't the first to run to the cloud. We wanted to optimize this, right? So first and foremost, since it's an AWS conference, I have native, right, AMIs that you can deploy in AWS of our solutions. We announced earlier this week, of course, some of our things are in the marketplace now, so you can start to auto-deploy some of these things as you go forward to make the agility component a lot easier as you move forward and as you move and start to put things on Platform 3 and lift and shift applications. Right? But client direct backup is very, very important. This is part of the efficiency piece, so it's the balance. So you're right, I have a server, obviously, the catalog or the indexing server, but the clients themselves, the EC2 clients themselves, they send data directly to S3. Right? So that alleviates a lot of the pressure on the infrastructure components where a lot of the competitors have to use a lot of different media servers to gain that scale, and that's when the cost and inefficiency start to go down. So the clients send directly to S3. They send it in a deduped framework, right? They do it a block, 256 block dedupe. But I also encrypt the data as I send it from the client to S3. And one of the important things from there is, from an efficiency standpoint, the metadata and the data are on a different plane. So I'm sending the data directly to S3. The metadata is sent down here to what we call this Cloud Boost appliance or a cloud appliance. So it keeps track of the metadata. All that data in S3, all the encryption keys that you have is stored on a separate component. And the keys are held separate from the S3 instance. From a security perspective, you don't want the keys right next to the data in case it was compromised. But most importantly, I talk about having these things being able to back themselves up on a schedule. So let's say a media agent or the catalog server goes down for any reason. Hey, on a schedule, I have that backed up from last night. So if it drops for any reason, I can redeploy that fairly instantaneously and be back up and running, because the cloud is about agility, and I want to be able to do these things similar as much as I can, right? Have the same type of properties that I had on-prem. That's where the agility and the cost efficiencies go down when I don't have the human capital involved that I had on-prem back in the days of old. Now, I'll give you an example of this because I think you really have to put it in context of what we mean by architecture matters. This is a 50 terabyte example, right? We went out there and said, hey, our friends at ESG did some independent analysis, and we said, hey, what does this look like? I won't call the vendors out by name, but vendor A's approach is, hey, I'm in the cloud. I write to S3. That means I'm cloud friendly, right? Let's go ahead and use the product. But without dedupe and only compression, the cost of storage is very, very high as you tend to back up more and more data every single day, right? So the cost can go high. Backup vendor B has a little bit different approach, right? They do use deduplication, but it's not very efficient, right? So the cost of compute to have those media agents with limited scale do deduplication really brings the EC2 cost really, up significantly. You can see kind of that on the gray bar with backup vendor B. So it's not very a balanced approach, very, very high on compute. And then, right, architecture matters from Dell EMC. A very balanced approach. I do utilize S3. I do use deduplication. I use very low, that client-based backup, very low EC2 and compute instances to be able to provide that at a much larger scale. So as you start to scale out, the costs are significantly lower. You can see here, again, a 50 terabyte example. Backup vendor A for 50 terabytes. This is a monthly charge. A cloud build, north of $14,000. Backup vendor B is a little over $10,000. And when you have an optimized approach, you look at Dell EMC for protecting the same amount of data, right, is a little north of $5,000 a month. So when we look at this, here's that scale, because you're saying it's always important to say, well, what am I going to get at 50 terabytes versus 400? As you embark upon your cloud journey, this data will start to grow, and so do the costs. Now, the same vendors there, right? Backup vendor A's in yellow, backup vendor B's in red. If you could guess who they are, again, I'm not going to mention them by name. And then you have Dell EMC at the bottom in blue, our favorite color. So the top approach is, hey, S3, no dedupe compression only. As you can see, right, most always our approach is going to be 68% lower, right? S3 cost, infrastructure cost. When you go to backup vendor B, we're almost 50% always lower, right, using this approach. So as you embark upon your cloud journey, right, it's very important why architecture matters versus, hey, I can, right, utilize AWS. I can deploy it. But using the architecture and the infrastructure, it's like a taxi, right? The meter's always running. So being able to do it and being able to do it correctly is our approach when it comes to data protection. You can go out and check this white paper. So the chart that I just showed you, ESG did a nice white paper and analysis, and it's light reading on the weekend. If you're really into technology, you can kind of go through this from an EC2, EBS, and S3 perspective. Look at all the parts and pieces that I just mentioned for kind of a deeper view into what I just discussed. Now, I do want to introduce, it's always important to have a good customer that can validate for you and that's using these products. I want to introduce Dan Pollock from Oath. And Dan, I'll give this to you. I think you know how to use it. Thank you.
Let's see what I can do. OK, thanks. I guess that's working. So I work for a company called Oath. So what is Oath? Oath is Yahoo and AOL. They were combined after being purchased by Verizon, and now it's Oath. That slide doesn't work as well as I hoped it would. So anyway, the idea here is that we wanted to move some infrastructure to the public cloud so that we could continue to do business as usual. And this is even before the merger, because the idea is that owning all your own data centers just isn't the way to go anymore. So what do we need to do to make that all happen? And so, when we looked at what needs to happen when you move systems to the cloud, we said, well, gee, how do we do that? Architecture matters, right? And what's the best way to do that? And so what we decided was that we would extend into the cloud and do a hybrid on-prem, off-prem offering for our customers. And the idea there is that there's very little disruption to the customers that we have so that they don't have to worry about our struggles to get to the cloud. They have their own struggles, but they know that when they come to us for the backup that we provide and for the services that we provide, they don't have to have a great deal of angst over what we're doing. They just know that whether it's in the cloud or on-prem, they're going to get the same level of service, and they're going to get the same capabilities when they do that. And so we chose to extend our connectivity into the public cloud. We use a significant amount of bandwidth through AWS Direct Connects, and that enables significant performance increases and latency sort of stability that makes it so that we can back up data very effectively and very efficiently without having to worry once again about sort of unexpected behaviors and results, right? We also decided for security reasons and for segregation reasons that we should go into things like the VPC offerings that they have, so we can keep all of the individual data sets and individual customers and individual parts of the business separate. And so one of the things that you have to do is figure out who goes where and then either create the connectivity back and forth between those different virtual instances or to self-contain them all together so that there's no connectivity depending on what the data type is. So if you have significant needs around data security, you want to make sure that everything is contained as much as possible, right? So when we're doing that, we needed to have backup systems that could be in the cloud, service the cloud, and be secure within the cloud so that they can make sure, like I said, that the customers would retain the same amount of confidence that they had with the on-premise sort of offerings that we had, right? And so obviously, like, you know, there are all these concerns, right? Cost controls, like I said, security, so safety, the skill set, like how do you learn to do cloud things, right? And people have to go through all of this process. And then, you know, what is the technology direction of the company, right? So we started this before the merger began to even be a thing, but now we are continuing it through the merger and on. And the idea that, like, does that change the direction? Do we still want to be in the public cloud? Do they want to go back to all the data centers, right? So we needed to kind of contemplate all of this stuff while we were building what we thought was an offering that our customers could consume in the same way. And so what we settled on was basically all complementary technologies for what we already had within the on-premise environment. So this is a list of things that we do both in-house and through the hybrid cloud, right? So Data Domain Virtual Edition in the cloud. We have Data Domain on-premise. That is 100% compatible. There's no issues, there's no concerns. Our customers are familiar with all of that stuff, at least from a service level and from a capabilities level. And so when we do those things, we know what kind of result we're going to get. And then Cloud Boost appliances, right? So they talked about that a little bit, and the idea there is that sometimes you want to bypass the traditional sort of, what you call it, endpoint infrastructure where you're not keeping the data on tape or disk anymore. You want to keep it in something that's just stateful but belongs in the cloud instead. So in order to do that, we went to Cloud Boost appliances. That allows us to, instead of back up to local disk or local tape, we can now back up straight into a cloud storage service. In this case, the Cloud Boost appliances talk to S3, but the idea there is that if you want your stateful on-disk data to be somewhere, you have to pick what that is, and if you want that to be in the cloud as your option, then the way to get it there through our backup infrastructure software is to go to the Cloud Boost appliances, right? And then one of the last things is the software selection for managing all of these backups, and this is sort of traditional software backup management or backup software management. The idea is that you have to keep track of everything that you backed up, and you have to know kind of where it all is at any given time. And the idea is that when we looked at the different capabilities for all the different software options that we had, we went with a very well integrated backup management software. Obviously, if you stay within one vendor, you get better integration, and so for us, that was a significant benefit. So the EMC software products are built to talk to the EMC hardware products, and yes, that's sort of homogeneous from a acquisition standpoint, but it really does help when you're looking at kind of what you want to get done. So these are just a couple of quick use cases, right? Before we had physical data domains, Frankfurt and London. Now we have virtual data domains in AWS, EU Central, and EU West. Nothing changes except where the data went. Here's another one. This is kind of a build slide. We needed to move the studio from its current location to new locations. So the idea is that you back it all up into data domain, move all the physical hardware, and then restore it all. And that way you know the data is safe while you're doing a move, which is potentially risky. That's it.
First of all, I'd like to thank you very much
Sure.
for putting your trust in Dell EMC and the data protection. We look forward to continued partnership as we go. Sorry we didn't get the slides to you earlier, but you did a fantastic job. This session is over. Agility, performance, scalability, data protection solutions from Dell EMC. It's not just about putting your data out there, it's about making sure that you have all those things, and we've done it the correct way. Not the first, but look forward to continued partnership. Appreciate it. Thank you guys for the session.
Yeah, if you have questions, come find me.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Brian and Dan. Please come back and join us for our next presentation at 2:30 this afternoon.